you've been looking at things at a global level and a regional level and a state level, and so now I'm going to talk to you about a local level, what we're doing in the city of Portland. And in Portland, we have over 20 years, actually, of history working on climate action. We were the first local government in the United States to adopt a climate action plan in 1993. See, it had some fancy clip art, came complete with a 5.5-inch floppy disk. So we've been working on this for a really long time. In 2001, we updated that plan, and it became a joint plan between the city of Portland and Multnomah County, the county within which we reside. And then again in 2009, we updated the plan again, and that plan, the 2009 plan, is what we have been working to implement since then. So over the last 20 years, we've really had some tremendous progress and accomplished some significant things. Before I get to that, I want to tell you about how we decide what to work on. So we've heard a lot this morning about carbon emissions, and it's important to understand where those carbon emissions are coming from. And there are a couple of ways that we can look at that. The most traditional way is this pie chart on the left-hand side for you, which is we kind of call a production-based inventory. And so this is, you can see transportation is about 40%. So that's the gasoline and the diesel, the fuel that we burn in our vehicles to move people and goods around. So about 40% of our emissions come from that. The rest of our emissions come from the energy that we use in our homes. So 20% comes from our what we consume in our homes, 24% from businesses, and then the energy that we use to make things in industry. And then there's this tiny little orange sliver, which is waste disposal, and that's the methane that comes from the stuff that we send to the landfill. So this is typically, and the blue stuff there is primarily natural gas and electricity that are the energy sources for that. So this is how we typically measure our emissions and track our emissions over time. The pie chart on the right is what's called a consumption-based inventory, and this takes all of this and includes all of the emissions that are generated elsewhere to produce the things that we consume. So we add in food, so you can see food is 15%. So all of the emissions that come from growing, transporting, processing, keeping our food cool in the grocery store. So that's a big source of emissions. And then all of the stuff that we buy, that we consume, that we dispose of. Much of that's made in the US, and a lot of that is made in other countries as well. So you've seen some charts this morning that show, for example, the emissions from China. A lot of those emissions, while they're emitted in China, are on us because we are the ones that are consuming those goods. And so that's another way that you can look at where all of those emissions are coming from. So at a local level, when we try to decide, well, what are we going to work on to reduce our carbon emissions, we need to take all of that into consideration. And in our plan, we have what we call 8 action areas, and you'll see those segments from those pie charts reflected here. So the energy that we use in our homes and buildings, the fuels that we use to move people and goods around, the things that we consume, and the little sliver from the things that we throw away, the solid waste. Number 5 over there, you'll see food and agriculture. So we look at the actions that local governments can take, local residents, local businesses, to reduce emissions across all of those sectors. So we've been working on this for 20 years, and we've accomplished some significant things. One example, this shows solar installations in the city of Portland, going back to about 2003. And you can see that there's been a significant, really, explosion in the installation of solar. The yellow part of the bar chart there is actually through a program that was created by neighborhoods where neighbors got together and they bought solar panels in bulk. So they were able to get together with all their neighbors, buy huge quantities of solar panels, and that really drove the price down. And so that resulted in this significant increase in installation. Portland has the highest number of people that ride their bicycle to work and to school. So you can see we're at about 7% of Portlanders commute by bike, which is continuing to climb. And you can see some of our other sort of competitors in that area, Minneapolis, Seattle, San Francisco. So a lot of folks in Portland use alternative transportation. Transit ridership has more than doubled since 1990. Unfortunately, you can see there's a bit of a plateau there, which is the case, I think, in most cities due to budget cuts and restraints and cuts in transit services. So definitely that's a big challenge for us to continue to see that ridership increase. Recycling rate has more than doubled since 1990. We now have a recycling rate of about 68%. We often, between Seattle and San Francisco, we're always sort of juggling for who gets the mantle of the highest recycling rate in the country. And so between the three of us, we all have a very high recycling rate. Portlanders drive less per day than most of people in the rest of the United States, and certainly compared to other cities of our size. Portlanders drive about, per person, 18 miles a day. That means that Portlanders have a lot fewer transportation costs, which means they have more disposable income to spend on other goods and services. And much like Seattle and Portland, that often comes in the form of lattes and microbrews. But it means that we don't have refineries in Oregon. We don't have sources of petroleum in Oregon. So all of the money that we spend to put fuel in our vehicles immediately goes out of the state. And so this is often is referred to as a green dividend, or those reduced transportation costs mean that we have money to spend on other things. So what does that all mean in terms of our carbon emissions? This graph starts in 1990 here on the left, goes to 2011. And the top line is the emissions trend for the United States, and the bottom line, the yellow line, is for Multnomah County, again where Portland is located. And you can see it around the year 2000, Portland started to have a significant diversion from the national trend in terms of our emissions. Right now we are at about an 8% reduction below 1990 levels, so our baseline where we start sort of all of our emission goal sort of baseline year is 1990, so we're currently at about 8% below, and that's for total emissions. As you learned this morning, what's important is the total amount of carbon emissions that we're putting into the atmosphere. It doesn't really matter how many emissions per person, it's the total amount of carbon, and so this is looking at that total amount of carbon. During that same time, since 1990 though, we've had a significant population increase. So this is looking at our emissions per person. So the yellow area represents population increase. We've had about a 30% population increase since 1990. We've been able to drive our emissions down the green line, and when you look at it on a per person basis, we've seen about a 28% reduction per person in carbon emissions. So that's well over a quarter of the carbon emissions that each person generated in 1990. We've gone down 28%.
Quick question, what happened in 05 and 06? The last two charts had
a little bump?
Yeah, that one, and then the driving, the amount of driving that Portlanders did took a big shoot up in 04 and 05, 05 and 06. I'm just curious, anybody know why?
Boy, we often get this question. It's really complicated because there's so many factors at play. I couldn't tell you what caused that bump in the driving. Sometimes it has to do with where our fuel is coming from. The electricity grid shifts a lot from year to year, so some years we might have more coal in the electricity mix, so that might be part of that bump. There could be some other things going on. A lot of what happened here and around the year 2000 was sort of a perfect storm of several things coming together. That's when a lot of our light rail system and some of the other transportation options really became more viable, and so we saw a significant reduction in sort of the use of cars. We also had some industrial changes that happened. Some aluminum plants closed down, and so that certainly dropped our emissions as well. So it's often really difficult to sort of tease out exactly what happened. We have done some work, I didn't include the graph here, to look at. Often what we hear is, well, like here's a good example. You can kind of see the effect of the recession, right? So as the engine of the economy sort of slows down, emissions go down. And so we've teased apart. Often we hear, oh, well, Portland's emissions reduction has a lot to do with the economy. You have a high unemployment rate, and we've actually been able to show that most of those emission reductions are coming from fuel switching, so going from heavy fuel oils to natural gas, or reduction in like higher fuel efficiency of vehicles. So which is a long way to say it's really complicated, and you often can't sort of pinpoint anything on the trend to any particular thing happening.
Why is it going up
So a couple of things. It could be changes in our electricity mix. The economy is starting to come back up again, so we're starting to see a little uptick from that as well. Odds are, so we try to not necessarily compare year to year, but look over the long-term trend, and so hopefully we'll continue to sort of see this stair-step pattern that goes down. So you've seen this before. There's this world of mitigation where we're focusing on trying to reduce our carbon emissions, and that's where Portland has been spending most of the last 20 years, has really been focused on that sphere. We're now beginning to, as you've heard this morning, as with lots of other local governments, beginning to really tackle this issue of climate preparation. So to that end, we, here in the next month or two, should have a draft climate change preparation strategy that's out for public comment. And this really identifies all of the actions that we think we need to take to begin preparing for climate, the climate impacts. We're starting to see the impacts of climate change in the Pacific Northwest. For Portland, we've sort of boiled it down to similar to what you've heard today. Dry is going to get drier, wet's going to get wetter. So one of the big things that we need to deal with is the fact that we expect to have hotter, drier summers with more high heat days, and that will translate into a variety of different impacts that we need to prepare for, including increased temperature and urban heat island effect, increased drought, and increased wildfire frequency and intensity. So these are the primary risks that we've identified that we need to plan around as it relates to summers. Then in winter, warmer, wetter winters. So we're going to have more wet, sort of when we least need it, and that will really exacerbate existing problems that we have related to damaging floods and increased landslides. What you don't see here, that you would probably see for a lot of other communities in the Pacific Northwest, and what you're going to be talking about later today, is issues with water supply. Portland is exceedingly lucky in that our water supply system, a couple of reasons. We don't expect to have issues with water supply, and that's because our water is a rain-fed system. It's not reliant on snowpack, as many of the communities in the Pacific Northwest are reliant upon. So, and we have big reservoirs in the watershed to hold a bunch of that water for our use in the summer, and we also have big storage capacity in the city. And then we also have a backup water supply system in the form of ground wells, or groundwater wells. And we can run one system, the other system, or both systems together. And so we really have sort of a backup system for our water supply, and we don't expect to have that as an issue, so that's not reflected here. Another thing that isn't a significant issue for us is sea level rise, because we're not directly on the ocean. Tides do influence the rivers in Portland, and so we are going to be keeping an eye on how sea level rise influences the river levels within the city. But other than that, it really isn't a huge significant issue for us. So we have, over the last couple of years, taken all of that information and really begun looking at how is the city of Portland most vulnerable. So we looked at how we're vulnerable in terms of the built environment and our infrastructure. So that's looking at our roads, sewers, stormwater, parks, our natural resources. We have a lot of green space and open area, wildlife habitat, wetlands within the urban environment. How will those be impacted? And then also looking at health and human services, which you haven't necessarily heard a lot about so far today, but really particularly the temperature increases will cause problems both in terms of heat-related illness as well as exacerbation of problems like respiratory disease like asthma because of reduced air quality. And so we've been working jointly with Multnomah County and the county health department to really identify where we're most vulnerable in terms of the humans, the human aspect in the human system. So we'll have a strategy coming out soon that identifies the actions that we think we need to be taking in the near term as well as in the long term to address some of these vulnerabilities. So lastly, I just want to sort of leave you again with this emissions trend graph, and I often refer to this as the good news slide. And as most of you know, I think Portland could pat ourselves on the back and say, look at us, we're so much better than everybody else, our work here is done. But really, as you know, with any graphs like this, it's often a matter of perspective in terms of what it tells you. And this really is the big picture. So that second green dot down there is where we need to get to in terms of our emissions reduction. That represents an 80% reduction in carbon emissions by 2050, which is the official emissions target for the city of Portland. And that really is the scale of emission reductions that we're talking about to avoid being, that when you looked at those different scenarios in that worst case scenario, to avoid that trajectory, this is the type of emission reduction we need to see. So while Portland is doing a great job and we're doing a lot better than some, the changes that we need to make to get to that second green dot are pretty significant. It's really a fundamental shift in how we operate our cities, how we run our homes, our buildings, how we move around, and that's going to require some significant changes. And I think in Portland we believe that we can get there. And it doesn't mean that we all need to be taking cold showers and drinking warm beer. There are ways to get there, to live in a low-carbon society that, and I think, again, you've heard it already, this building represents that. You can rethink how we build things and how we operate things in a way that really is fundamentally and profoundly different, and that's what we need to get to. So we are constantly updating our plans. We're in the process right now of updating that 2009 plan, as well as developing this new climate preparation strategy. And that's because to get down and to keep that downward pressure on those emission trends, you have to constantly be reassessing what's working, what's not working, and what's the next big thing that as local government we can do to really push things to the next level. And so we're in the process right now of trying to identify what that is for us for the next iteration of our climate plan. If you want any of the information about our climate work, you can find it on this website, which will be included, I'm sure, in the resources that are provided for you. And thank you so much for your time.